Hello guys, this is Avrath and welcome back to my channel. Before we start today's video, I would really like to just express how thankful I am for the fact that so many of you tuned in to my previous video, which was a DPS guide. So basically a tutorial on how to improve your damage. That was actually my first longer video that I ever uploaded to YouTube. And I could never in my wildest imagination think that so many of you would enjoy it. And yeah, I'm really thankful. And if anyone here now has not watched this video yet, I'm gonna link to it in the description and also in the end of this video. And I think it will be very helpful for you if you watch it. It's quite long, but you can watch it in segments. It's worth it, I hope. But enough about that. Let's start the topic of today's video. And what I want to do today is to highlight for you a very strong necromancer build when it comes to sustained damage. And as you can see here on the screen at the bottom, this is the result that I get in a 1 minute solo training dummy run. And we will of course watch the run together at the end of the video. But before we do that, I want to explain to you all the choices and the theorycrafting that is behind this build. So first of all, I'm going to show you which set I'm using. Then we're going to talk about the skills. And then we're going to talk about which essences I use. And then we're gonna look at the legendary gems. After that, we will do some theory crafting together, where I will explain to you why I chose, for example, one specific essence over another essence, or one specific legendary gem over another legendary gem. And I hope that this segment will be very helpful to understand the logic behind the choices made in this video. And of course, as the grand finale, we're gonna watch the run together and just see how it works in action. And I hope you're gonna enjoy it, because it's a lot of damage. But first, let us talk about the set I'm using. I've mentioned this in my previous video. I tend to always use 6 pieces of the shepherd set when I'm trying to optimize my damage output as much as possible. The good thing about this set is that it works very, very well with summons, of course. And if you have 2 pieces equipped, it will increase the damage of your summons by 15%. If you have 4 pieces equipped, it will increase your critical hit chance by up to 18%. And this will almost always be maxed. And if you have all the 6 pieces equipped, you will actually gain a very, very strong buff every 40 seconds, which gives your summons a lot of attack speed. It's 60% attack speed for 12 seconds. And this is the reason why I choose to always use 6 pieces instead of 4, because this last buff is so extremely strong. Attack speed is very important in Diablo Immortal, so I wouldn't change this out. I just want to mention though that this video is about sustained damage, and I've been using it now on the training dummy. But of course there might be instances in many dungeons, for example, where maybe it's wise to switch out 2 pieces for Isatar instead, so that you get extra movement speed. Because then you want to look at, okay, what is the total time it takes to finish this content? So of course it's situational, but now we're talking about strictly about damage output, and then 6 pieces of shepherd is my to-go choice. So let's talk about the skills. First of all, I'm using Soulfire, and the main reason for using Soulfire is because when I enter the training dummy run, I make sure to have the ultimate ready, because the ultimate with Soulfire is extremely strong. After that, I of course use the command golem. I use the command skeletons, I use the skeletal mage, and finally I use the bone wall to buff my damage. And we will talk about next the essences I use to change these skills into to have the effects that I need for this build. So first of all, I have the Skull Veil helmet. It prolongs the duration of my skeletal mages, and my reasoning was that when I do these sustained damage runs, I want to look at the breakdown, like how much damage did my golem do, how much damage did my primary attack do, etc, etc. And it was quite clear to me that with the new offhand, we're gonna show it soon, the mages are very, very strong. So the more I can prolong the duration or increase the damage of the mages, it's gonna have greater output on the total damage output compared to buffing the damage of a weaker skill. So that's the reasoning behind putting in this helmet. After that, I use the Bloodless Hierophant chest piece. It's the new chest piece for necromancers, and it's very, very strong. It turns your bone wall into a buff that buffs your damage by 40%, and 40% is a lot for a buff. So yeah, very strong. For the shoulders, I use Executive Discontent. I've been trying to do these runs with many different types of shoulders, and we're going to talk more about that in the Theorycrafting. But in the end, this shoulder performed the best, so that's why I use it. As the leg piece, I use Sacral Chausses. I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrong, but what it does is that it increases the bone wall duration. And as I told you, the bone wall is a very strong buff. So of course, the longer uptime I can have on it, the better for the damage output. As the first main hand, I use No Rest, No Peace. What it actually basically does is that whenever one of your skeletons dies, it will give you and your summons an attack speed buff. And the attack speed buff, if you have maxed out your Essence Mastery, is at 38%, and that's also very high. And as I told you, attack speed is very important in Diablo Immortal, so I realized that in order to maximize the output of my damage as much as possible, I couldn't leave this essence out. The next choice for the first offhand is the prong. And at first sight, maybe the prong feels a little bit strange, since I don't use the helmet that lets you explode your skeletons at will to trigger No Rest, No Peace. But during the theory crafting session of this video, I'm gonna explain to you why the prong is actually working best with this build. The second main hand that I use is Pleasant Venom. It turns my golem into a poison golem, and what's very good with the poison golem is that it places a debuff on the target, so it means that the target will take 10% more damage, which is very important, because that affects the damage not only from the golem, it affects the damage from all of my summons and from my primary attack as well. So that was an easy choice to include. And lastly, this was also a very easy choice. It's the new offhand, Viscerae Coffin Lid. I'm sorry again if the pronunciation is wrong, but this offhand is extremely strong. And yeah, if you want to do as much damage as possible, if that's the goal, then you can't leave this essence out. If you have it, you should use it. So that's the essences I use for this build. So let us talk about the legendary gems that I use. And first I have the Mother's Lament, and it's in the helmet slot, and it's also at rank 10, which is very important, because the awakened effect of the Skullveil helmet is that it decreases the cooldown reduction. or it increases the cooldown reduction on my mages by 10%. And why this is so important, I'm gonna explain later in the video. But also the gem itself, Mother's Lament, is very, very strong. It gives me 32% critical hit chance at rank 10 for 6 seconds. And this effect will trigger every 20 seconds. And I can also increase this 6 seconds effect, this 6 second duration, by having as much as possible beneficial effect duration attribute on my Reforge or on my magical attributes. So very easy choice. On my next piece, on the chest, I use the Bloody Reach. It's also at rank 10. It decreases the cooldown reduction on my bone wall, the buff that I mentioned in the previous segment. So it's also great to have this slot awakened. And if we look at the gem itself, it gives up to 24% extra damage depending on how far away I stand from the target. And recently I also found out by very skilled necromancers in the official Diablo Immortal Discord channel that you actually get the double effect from Bloody Reach as a necromancer. I don't know why, but I tried to test it, and according to my calculations this is correct. So it looks like if I get actually 48% increased damage when I stand up to 8 yards away from the target. So it's very easy to include this gem, of course. Even without that double effect, I would still include it because it's very strong. The next gem I use on my shoulder slot, it's the Echoing Shade. It's at rank 8, and basically it can summon 3 clones of myself that uses primary attack. This gem is very, very strong for necromancers because the clones actually get affected by all the magical attributes that affect summons. And I have really tried to perfect my build as much as possible, which means that when I do the breakdown on my damage in a dummy run, the Echoing Shade is almost performing as good as the mages. Not really, but almost. And I couldn't trade this gem out for anything as a necromancer. As you can observe, I have it in my shoulder slot, so it's not awakened. The awakened effect of the shoulder will give 10% extra life to my mages. And this is of course not necessary at the training dummy. There might be other cases, if you are in a raid or gauntlet, for example, where this might be a more reasonable option. But yeah, just so you understand that it's not only about what gems you put in, you also have to think about these minor details. The next gem that I have in my pants slot, it's the Freedom and Devotion. It prolongs the duration on all of my summons by 24%. It also increases the damage a little bit by 3%. And at the beginning I wasn't sure if I had to include this gem or not, and I'm going to talk about that more in the Theorycrafting session. But in the end this was the right choice to include it. The next gem that I use at the first main hand slot is the Bottled Hope. Bottled Hope is a very strong gem for any class, but it's extra strong for necromancers because actually if you manage to buff both yourself and your summons at the same time, you get the double effect from the Bottled Hope. Because first of all you buff your own damage, and this will increase the damage of your summons. But then the summons are also buffed, so it increases the damage again. So it's a double effect once more. And yeah, for some reason this is how it works with certain buffs. I'm not sure exactly yet. I haven't tried everything out, but with the Bottled Hope it works like this. After this I put in Berserker's Eye. in my first offhand slot. So this is the offhand slot where I have the prong. And I'm also going to discuss this gem later, because it was not clear from the beginning if I would choose this one either. But in the end, it is a clear choice, and I'm going to explain to you later why. In the second main hand slot, I used the Blood-Soaked Jade, and it's at rank 8. It's a very good gem. It should be in any build in Diablo Immortal. You don't have to have it at rank 8, of course, but it's a nice damage buff, and also, yes, in general, it's very nice with the extra movement speed. So yeah, I really like Blood-Soaked Jade, for sure. So finally, on my second offhand, I have the Pain Clasp. The Pain Clasp is also at rank 10, so it awakens the shield, the offhand, and it's the same effect as on the helmet. It will actually increase the cooldown reduction on the mages, and that's very important. And like I said, I'm gonna explain to you why. But the gem itself is also very strong. It increases the damage done by 24%, as long as the enemy has a continual damage effect that is active on it for the moment. As a necromancer, it's very easy with this build to apply it, because actually when the poison golem hits the target, it will add this effect, a continual damage effect on the target. So Pain Clasp will be active almost all the time. So very strong gem. So it was also an easy choice. So finally we have reached my favorite segment. It's the Theorycrafting segment. And first we're going to talk about the skills that I've chosen in this build. And as you can see, we started with 5 skills, and some of them they're very easy to include, like the Command Golem, Command Skeletons, and Skeletal Mage. There is no way that I would exclude any of these, so there's not really that much theory crafting that needs to be done. But the other 2 skills, my primary attack and also the Bone Wall, I still had to maybe think a little bit and do some testing before coming to the conclusion about which skill was the best to use for this 1-minute dummy run. And first I had to choose between Soulfire and Bone Spear. And at first I thought that, okay, maybe Bone Spear is actually a little bit stronger because it makes more damage per hit. And it also has a little bit higher attack speed, just a little bit. But the thing with Soulfire is that it has a very strong ultimate. So perhaps, I mean, the ultimate will be active for around 12 seconds. And perhaps that upside will outperform the Bone Spear in a 1-minute run. And after doing a few runs with both options, I have to say that it's very, very close. So the Bone Spear is very, very viable when it comes to sustained damage. Also, of course, this is at the training dummy, and the Bone Spear, I would maybe even put that in if I want to make a sustained damage build, because you never know when your ultimate is active, because it takes some time to recharge it. But in this case, I wanted to maximize the damage output during this 1-minute run. And in the end, it was clear that the Soulfire won by just a little bit. So that's why I used Soulfire instead of Bone Spear. The second skill that I was not 100% sure of was whether the Bone Wall always will outperform the Dark Curse. And then I don't mean the vanilla Dark Curse, I mean the Dark Curse that is changed by the Pants Essence that will increase the attack speed of your summons. I was quite sure that the Bone Wall would be the clear choice, but I still wanted to theorycraft around it and try it out. And no matter which combinations I used to try to increase the damage using the Dark Curse effect instead of Bone Wall, I didn't manage to do it. So in the end, it was a very easy choice to choose Bone Wall over Dark Curse, actually. But it's not only about the skills that I put in. The real theory crafting begins, of course, with the essences and perhaps the legendary gems. So here are the essences that we use in this build, and some of them are quite easy to include. I mean, the chest piece. The only build where the chest piece actually matters is the build where you use the Bone Wall buff. If you ever would use the Dark Curse buff instead, then there's nothing that you can use in your chest slot. So there was not a lot of theory crafting going on when it came to the chest piece. And I can say the same about the main hands, because yeah, as I said in earlier in this video, I can't really sacrifice the attack speed buff from no rest, no peace. I have to include it somehow. And I can't sacrifice the debuff that the poison golem puts on the enemy target. So that was also not up for debate. And the new offhand for necromancers, the damage output is insane. So the same thing there. There was no debate in my head about the choice there. But the rest of the pieces, there were actually some considerations about what I should do. And if we start by looking at the helmet, my reasoning for choosing this helmet from the beginning, and I actually thought that, okay, for sustained damage, I believe that this helmet will perform the best. Because if you go to the training dummy and you see which skill makes the most damage, as I mentioned, the mages with the new offhand, they are super, super strong. Before this patch, I actually, for sustained damage, experimented with the golem duration helmet, because then the golem was the strongest of my skills. But since this patch, it's the mages. And as you can see here, this helmet increases the duration by 39%. And it also, if it's awakened, decreases the cooldown by 10%. So yeah, I thought that probably for sustained damage, this will be the best. But there are, of course, other choices. You might consider coals for ice. And since you have the prong in one of your offhand slots, this will actually help you to control when to apply the attack speed buff. But after some more thinking, I realized that this will actually not be necessary, because you can actually only have 6 mages and skeletons alive at the same time. And if you summon a third mage, one of the skeletons will die and it will apply this buff. And in the end, you basically control when to apply the attack speed buff anyways. So therefore, yeah, this helmet didn't make the cut. I was also thinking like, okay, maybe there's something up with the archer helmet, the Mirorictus. But yeah, I tried it out. I didn't really believe in it, but I just wanted to show you here that at least I tried it and it was a lot worse as expected. I was also thinking, because as I said in the previous segment, some buffs, they're acting a little bit strange. Most buffs, you can't stack them, but in some cases it seems like it still somehow affects the damage. I will have to do more research about this, because I'm not 100% sure yet. But I thought that maybe the new necromancer helmet will somehow be able to increase the damage of this build. And yes, this helmet is very strong, but in the end we had a clear winner here, and it was the Skull Veil. So and also as I mentioned, as you can see, the awakened effect of the Skull Veil is that it decreases the cooldown of the skeletal mage, and that's very vital for this build actually. So next we're going to talk about the shoulder slot, and here I was actually not entirely sure from the start which essence to use. But I actually started with the executive discontent because I thought like, okay, the buff will be active when I engage the enemy, because what I do is that I stand outside the training dummy area, and then I spawn one mage, and then as soon as I can I spawn a second mage, and then I go inside to engage, and then I will spawn my third mage, and there will be a small window where I will actually get a buff from this effect. I also thought like maybe there's at one point, since I use both Freedom and Devotion and the Skull Veil helmet, that I can actually be able to have 5 skeletons active at the same time. But with my current cooldown reduction, this is not possible. I found that out. So and then I really don't understand why this actually outperforms some of the other shoulders, because it should be that the bone wall buff is at 40%, and that buff will be stronger than 4 mages active at the same time, which is 9.5 times 4, so that's 38%. But for some reason, this shoulder still outperformed the other shoulders I tried. But the first thing that came to my mind was that, yeah, of course, since the bone wall will be active and the buff will be applied all the time, it has to be quite wise to use Synod's Anointing instead of Executive Discontent. Because then I only have to pre-summon one mage outside the training dummy area. And then when I run inside, I can start with 2 mages in the fight, while also triggering the no rest, no peace. But for some reason, I didn't understand why at first. It didn't make as much damage. But I noticed that my attack speed buff didn't go off for a long period of time. And then I realized that, okay, if I spawn 2 mages at the same time, it will actually mean that they die at the same time. And yeah, then I have only 4 skeletons instead of 6. So even if I immediately summon another mage, one of the skeletons will not die, so therefore I will not get the attack speed buff. So after realizing this, I had to say, okay, I can't use this shoulder this way to increase the sustained damage. When I do a 10-second dummy run, then it's different, because then I benefit, I get attack speed buff as much as I can during these 10 seconds. So then it's different, but not for the 1-minute run. So that's just an interesting takeaway. As I mentioned earlier, I was experimenting with Dark Curse as well instead of Bone Wall, and I thought like, okay, maybe there's something with the Linger Mantle shoulder. It helps me to increase the duration of the Dark Curse buff that increases the attack speed of the summons. But as I said, in the end, the Bone Wall was a clear winner over Dark Curse. So, and I found this out very fast when trying it out. Lastly, I wanted to try the Sirocco, because as I said, some buffs they shouldn't be able to stack, but sometimes they do somehow. And I thought like, okay, maybe this essence doesn't count as a buff the same way. So if I put this in, maybe I can increase the damage of the mages further. But it's the same thing here. This also got outperformed by Executive Discontent. And yeah, I don't really know how much of this Executive Discontent buff that I can use. But yeah, it was the clear winner for sure. Lastly, we have the legs. I'm not going to dive too deep into it. We've already talked about Bone Wall and Dark Curse. I was thinking maybe I can switch this for Guided by Maggots, but as I've already explained, this was not viable, so I got rid of this idea quite fast. Now we come to the last essence that was actually up for debate. And this one is actually very interesting, because I was quite sure that the Dead Keen would be the best option for the 1 minute dummy run. When I do the 10-second dummy run, the Dead Keen outperforms the prong, and I saw no reason why it wouldn't do that in the 1 minute dummy run. I even thought it would be even more strong than the prong in a 1 minute dummy run, since the skeletons will die off one by one when we summon our mages. So we want to increase the damage on the golem as much as possible, while also getting the awakening effect of golem damage on the shield or the offhand. But after some time trying out different versions of this build, I realized that for some reason the attack speed buff from my main hand didn't go off whenever I summoned a new mage. And now, after some thinking, I know why, but at first I was very confused actually, and had to do a lot of troubleshooting to see what is going on. The first runs I did, I didn't even notice that the attack speed didn't go off, and I couldn't understand why the damage output was so low compared to what I think it should be. So I had to really think a bit, and then I realized that it actually works like this. When one of your skeleton mages dies, it takes some time for a new skeleton to summon. And this will be a problem when it comes to applying the attack speed buff, because things has to happen in the correct order. So just to illustrate this, let me go through it with you guys. So first, let me put on the pointer here. As I mentioned before, you can have a total of 6 skeletons and mages active at the same time. We're going to call our skeletons X, and we're going to call our skeletal mages Y. So basically before we engage and do anything, we will have only our skeletons alive. So then our composition will be 4 skeletons, right? And before we attack the training dummy, we want to pre-summon some mages outside the dummy area, because we want the first mage that we summon after we engage, we want to trigger the attack speed buff from the main hand. So first we summon 1 mage, and then our composition will be 4 skeletons and 1 mage. As soon as the cooldown is over, we're gonna summon a second mage, and then our composition will be 4 skeletons and 2 mages. This is when you're supposed to get ready to engage the training dummy, and right before the cooldown on the mage is finished, then you attack, which means that you can instantly summon the third mage, which will give us the composition of 3 skeletons and 3 mages. And when we summon this third mage, one of the skeletons will die, so it will trigger the attack speed buff. After some time, when the cooldown is over again, we can summon a 4th mage. And this means that the composition will look like this. When we summon the 4th mage, we will have 2 skeletons and 4 mages. And since one of the skeletons dies, it will trigger the attack speed buff again. But what will happen after this is that the first mage that we pre-summoned will die. And then we will have a composition of 2 skeletons and 3 mages. And if you can remember, we can have a total of 6 skeletons and mages together at the same time. So when the first skeletal mage dies, it opens up a spot. So what we want to happen is that we want a new skeleton to summon before we summon the mage. Because if we summon the mage, then we go back to this composition. But since we only had 2 skeletons alive, when we summon this 5th mage, it will not kill off a skeleton, so we will not get the buff. So we need to make sure that the skeleton summons first. We also need to make sure that before we summon the 5th mage, the 2nd mage that we summoned is not allowed to die. So there's a window. We have to summon the 5th mage after the skeleton summons and before the 2nd mage dies. And in order for this to be possible, we actually need the prong. Because when the first skeletal mage dies, it will take 8 seconds for a skeleton to spawn. And this is way too long. We need the prong to decrease this time to 3.44. Otherwise it's impossible. But without any cooldown reduction, it will also take too long before we can spawn the 5th mage, which will lead to the 2nd mage dying. And then when we summon the 5th mage, we won't kill off a skeleton then either. So basically, what I had to do was to try to find the perfect cooldown reduction in order for this cycle to work perfectly without me having to think about it. And that's how all of these essences and the gem and the skill works together. Because as you can see here, we have the prong to decrease the time it takes from 8 seconds to 3.44 seconds for a skeleton to summon. And we also needed to decrease the cooldown on the mage itself. And that's why it was so important to awaken the helmet slot and the offhand slot. So if you are not able to awaken one of these slots, you can try to find cooldown reduction on your set pieces. You can find it on the neck or on the rings or on the gloves, up to 5% per piece. So then you can try to get that from there instead. I also have to mention that the Bottled Hope also gives 4.5% cooldown reduction. So somehow the sweet spot to perfect this cycle is around 24.5%. Maybe it's possible to do it a few percentages up or down. But I actually tried to switch out one of the gems. So I put in the Blood-Soaked Jade in the shield instead, and then I didn't get this awakened effect anymore because I wanted to see if it affected how it worked. And actually then the cooldown to summon a new mage was too long, so I ended up failing to trigger the attack speed buff every time. So I didn't think that this would be important at the beginning, but now when we really dive into it, it upped the damage from around 230 million to over 260 million, so it made a huge difference. And maybe there are some other details here I haven't really studied yet that can maybe increase the damage even more. I have a theory, perhaps, that if I am able to decrease the cooldown even more on the mage, maybe it's possible to have the cycle with 5 mages active at the same time instead of 4 mages. That will lead to me having increased damage from the shoulder that I use, and it will also lead to me having one more mage active all the time, doing more damage. So maybe I can even pump this number over 300 million, but I'm not sure about what the cooldown reduction cap is on the skeletal mage, but I have to try it. I did try to activate my immortal buff, because currently I'm the immortal on my server, and this immortal buff actually gives me 25% cooldown reduction, and then my summons, I could summon a mage every 4.5 seconds or something like this, so it can go very low. But when I tried it, it actually went worse, because it messed up this cycle, so I didn't get the attack speed buff from the main hand. So in the end, it was still a lot of damage, but it didn't increase above 260 million. So yeah, very interesting mechanics here to think about, and that's what's so fun with this game, to really dive deep into the details, and to just find out, like in this case, that okay, if I add 10% cooldown reduction to this skill, I can actually increase the damage on a 1 minute dummy run from 230 million to 260 million. So that's a huge difference just from one minor detail. That's why I think it's very important for all of you to not only make decisions without thinking. If you want to perform at your top level, you really have to study the details, and hopefully my videos can help you do this better. So lastly, I want to theorycraft a little bit about the legendary gems. And to be honest with you, a lot of these gems were quite easy for me to include in this build. When I talk about Mother's Lament or Bloody Reach, Echoing Shade, Bottled Hope, Blood-Soaked Jade and Pain Clasp, I couldn't really find any contender for these spots. So that was an easy choice to include those 6 gems. But 2 of the gem slots that I'm currently having Freedom and Devotion and Berserker's Eye in, that was a little bit more tricky, because there's actually a 3rd gem that I was thinking about should go into this build. And this gem is Follower's Burden. And if we look at these gems on the Berserker's Eye, it gives me 16% increased damage plus 2% critical hit chance. And this looks very similar to Follower's Burden, which gives me 18% damage increase. It doesn't give me any critical hit chance, but a little bit more resonance. And when comparing these 2 gems, I know that critical hit chance is very, very strong in Diablo Immortal. And I was basically almost 100% sure that this would be stronger than a little bit extra resonance on the Follower's Burden. And when I ran the calculations, this was the case. And I also have to mention that in my previous video with the DPS-guide that I uploaded last week, I actually highlighted that I'm using Follower's Burden. But someone in the YouTube comments pointed this out to me, and I realized immediately that, yes, why am I using Follower's Burden in this setup instead of Berserker's Eye? So I was not that unsure now when doing this build whether I should include Follower's Burden over Berserker's Eye, because yeah, I know that Berserker's Eye is stronger now. But I was thinking about maybe including both of them and skip Freedom and Devotion. And yeah, basically I thought like, okay, if I remove Freedom and Devotion, it will lead to the mages being up a shorter period of time, but I will do more damage from everything else thanks to the Follower's Burden. I did think that the 24% duration plus the 3% damage from my summons will actually outperform the follower's burden, but I still wasn't 100% sure, so I had to try it myself. But it was quite clear only after the first run that in the sustained damage it has to be the freedom and devotion. When I do the 10-second run, I don't include freedom and devotion. Then I use both follower's burden and berserker's eye. I can also switch out berserker's eye for seeping bile. I actually had the best results when I had that combination. But yeah, for the 1 minute run, it was quite clear in the end that I have to include berserker's eye and freedom and devotion in the build. So now we have finally gone through everything that's important when it comes to this build, and I hope that this video has been insightful for you and that it can perhaps help you to make your own builds, or if you want to copy this one, feel free to have a go at it. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to post them down here in the comments, or if you have any feedback on anything I've mentioned in this video, because remember, everything here is based on my own theory crafting, and probably there's a lot, maybe not a lot, but a few minor details that are wrong, and I would be the first one to admit if I've made a mistake, and I'm just happy to improve even further. So if you have any tips, please post them in the comments. And also, I'm gonna post right in the description my Discord. If you want to ask me anything there, feel free to add me. And yeah, thank you so much for watching and tuning in to my channel again. And if you enjoy this type of content, I would also urge you to please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, because I'm gonna keep uploading videos like this in the future. And if you have any suggestions on what type of videos you want to see, you can also post them here in the comments. And I will try to answer as many as I can. So thank you very much, and until next time, now let's watch the video. Avrath el omno Kuro.